Richard Denis, we are so happy and delighted that you accepted our invitation to be the very first graduate student that we have interviewed on Conversatorio Cubano. You're currently, right now, you are in the throes of the final stages of defending your dissertation, and you are a graduate student and a candidate for the doctorate in Latin American history at Florida International University. So you are also an expert on journalism in Cuba. And this is a topic dear to my heart. It's dear to this particular edition of Conversatorio Cubano because the whole website this month is in some ways geared towards the past and geared towards, as well, the acquisition of the Eduardo Guayo Hernandez collection, which is a vast collection of materials from a photojournalist. So I want to start because you're sort of the expert on all of this. I want to start with just a question that's very basic and dear to many of our hearts, again, the historians who have relied on Cuban press. And that is for you to explain what you see as the role and the impact of journalism in Cuba, you know, in the 40s, potentially before, if you want to address that, but certainly in the 40s, and how you think that the creation of an anti-constitutional authoritarian regime after 1952 under Batista affected that role and the impact of journalism.
Thank you, Lily. And I want to say this is a really great honor to be sitting here with you. So thank you for the opportunity. So to your question, the 1940s themselves were a really propitious time for Cuban journalism. Cuban journalists got organized, they mobilized really for the first time in the Republic. And they were coming off a period, the first Batista anti-constitutional rule, his military regime, where they were severely repressed, particularly in the mid-1930s. But by the late 1930s, Batista kind of, starts to try to give the image that he's a Democrat. He's planning to, legitimate his rule by becoming president. The 1940 Constitution, that convention takes place, and journalists see this as a really, really opportune time to get together and really discuss and debate a lot of these kind of deep-seated issues that they had been dealing with for many years. A lot of them pertained to, very specifically, to professionalizing the industry. The industry had fallen into major disrepute in the 1930s after first Machado, where they were severely repressed, probably more so than at any time. I mean, there was violence against journalists were killed, publications were closed regularly. And so they come off of that. And then in the mid-1930s, Batista, under the Mendieta government, also institutes a culture of repression where he actually gives journalists what was known as a palma Christi, which is like a castor oil that they have to ingest, and that was specifically devised for journalists.
In order for them to it's like a form of torture. They would arrest these guys and then make them drink this.
Yeah, they did it to Miguel Ángel Quevedo in 1934. So they would arrest Miguel Ángel Quevedo, who was the proprietor of Bohemia magazine, was really going after Batista in summer 1934. And they picked him up. Basically, they would take them to the Laguito area, which is where they would torture people in an area of Havana. And they, without even telling him what was going on, and they gave him castor oil, and he actually suffered from stomach ailments for the rest of his life just from that one time. So it wasn't something you wanted done to you. Mm-hmm. And so they come off of this period into this late 30s, early 1940s period where everything changes, right? And actually, Batista liberalizes the press. He allows the communists to actually have their own publication, which was a really big deal in 1938. And so by 1940, journalists get together and they decide kind of on their own to tackle issues such as professionalizing the industry. The industry was very corrupt. The state, attempted to control the press through many different ways. One of the main ways was to providing them subsidies or sinecures, which were jobs, you know, kind of made up jobs where people didn't really even have to show up to the job and get paid, or outright bribes. And this was all done to really kind of control the narrative in the press. And there was also an institution known as the Bureaus de Prensa, where each ministry had like basically like a one-sheeter that they would provide the journalist, and the journalist was supposed to basically reproduce that sheet of what was essentially propaganda and publish that. And so the Bureaus de Prensa were hated by a lot of journalists, one of the many things. And so they get together in 1941, the week of Pearl Harbor, as it turns out, and they debate these issues for the first time. And they also interestingly talk about other things that really surprised me, like racism in journalism. You have Gustavo Urrutia, which was a Black journalist and an activist, who really takes a lot of these journalists to task, who are saying, we don't have racism in this country. And he's saying, oh, yes, we do. And, you know, he provides many examples of times when newspapers and journalists would call for the lynching of Afro-Cubans, or they would only publish the race of a person who committed a crime if they were Black. So if they were white, you know, the race was not published. So Urrutia really kind of goes after this and actually is able to successfully spearhead some of these motions that are eventually passed in the Congress. And so it's a moment when they decide to develop a journalism school, a state-of-the-art journalism school based on U.S. Journalistic standards, but it's really only the second one in Latin America. They also decide to institutionalize through a professional guild that will essentially stand up for journalistic ethical standards, will also stand up for the rights of journalists, and essentially serve as a labor union. So this is the first time that this really happens, and there's a lot of hope. So I'm struck by the hope that a lot of these journalists had for this new era of what they see, you know, really as modern journalism and as leaders in Latin America of this type of journalism.
Right,
and so, of course, all that will change.
Go ahead.
So all that does change in 1952 when Batista comes in. The press is you know, it's hard to there's so many different ways that you can look at freedom of the press, and certainly the state under the democratic governments of Batista, obviously, Grau and Prio, did try to control the press. And there were different ways in which each administration did so. But under Batista, everything changes. And he actually uses the press while Prio is still in power to really drum up very, very negative coverage of Prio to sort of pave the way for his military coup on March 10th, 1952. One of the first things he does on March 10th, 1952, is come up with the Ministry of Information and Propaganda. It's actually called Ministry of Propaganda at first, and then they decided to change the name because it sounds like something Nazi. So they decided to change the name. It's Ministry of Information, which is led by Ernesto de la Fe, who's a longtime journalist, a controversial journalist. And he is able to get other journalists on his side. That very same day, Luis Ortega from Prensa Libre, Alberto Salas Amaro, who's the director of a daily newspaper, Ataja, who appears with Batista in the famous pictures of Batista speaking to the press on that day. And so what's interesting about Batista is that on the one hand, he is seen as this patron of journalists, right? Because it is under his first constitutional administration that these institutions come into being, the school, the Colegio Nacional de Periodistas, which is a professional guild. It's also during this time that the pension system in Cuba for journalists is reformed. Yeah,
So, right. So, for those of us who are less familiar with the dates here involved, the democratic years of Batista are post 1934. He stages a coup in 34 against a revolutionary government that had just taken power in 33 against Machado. And then you walked us through that period until 1940 when he accedes to all these demands to hold elections. He holds elections. He gets himself elected, in part, ironically, because of the Communist Party's support and their power in the labor unions and this kind of deal that he
right.
forges with them. So you're really talking the Democratic election and his own presidency, 1940 to 1944, coincides with the professionalization of journalism. And then
Exactly.
you get two more presidencies until the coup of 52. And that
Right.
coup of 52 is one for which, as you say, he's extremely well primed. Like, he is perhaps better than any other leader of Cuba besides Fidel Castro, supremely aware of the importance of image making and control, or at least
Absolutely.
influence over the press. So if we were going to be concise and pick up that question again of what changes in the 50s, you know, what is it you think that you would point to as the sort of the singular characteristic of the way in which an anti-constitutional military regime like Batista's in the 50s impacted the role of journalism in Cuba?
Right. So what happens essentially is that the patronage part, which basically all Cuban presidents tried to patronize the press by providing subsidies, goes up times 1,000 under Batista's, unconstitutional rule. So he basically tries to buy everybody, including publications. He ends up successfully purchasing different publications. Dailies is what he wants. Daily newspapers, the commercial press.
Mm-hmm.
And he, from day one, really becomes the regime starts to repress journalists. And I think that there's this kind of idea where that doesn't really happen until after the 26th of July, after Fidel's attack on the Moncada barracks. But it actually happens quite early on, where he tries to control the press through the Ministry of Information. And when that's not successful, the regime immediately resorts to violence. And so there's a lot of incidents. I was struck by the amount of incidents of violence against journalists just in that first year of 1952, 1953. So there's violence. So that's basically new under this, this period. And there's this desire to try to co-opt the press any way that it can. And those efforts are amped up under after the 1952 coup to buy as many. I mean, I believe he spent several $100,000 by his own admission on the press. There were envelopes that were marked, for newspapers on his secretary's desk that his secretary, would deliver every week. So these are by Batista's own accounts. He really, it wasn't just violence. He did also employ the carrot approach. But certainly, what changes significantly is this new repressive, these new repressive methods against journalists and newspapers.
Mm-hmm. So what
then,
go ahead.
Amps up even more after 1955. 1955, there's a brief period of this kind of relaxation, and then that starts to change. And then we see the implementation of state censorship, so official state censorship. There's a brief period in 1953 when he does it. He doesn't do it again until 56. And then from then on, it's pretty steady until 1958, where the commercial press is essentially muzzled. So you only have really the clandestine press that is really, publishing anything about the revolution during periods of censorship.
Yes. So it brings to mind the magazines that came out in December of 1958, where they're just this thin and they basically say nothing. Right before the triumph of opposition forces over, and this moral victory over the dictatorship, and Batista flees in January 1st, 1959. So I've got a couple more questions, and so turning to that period.
Although they're very subtle,
Yeah.
subtle. If you look at Bohemia, they would put every 26th page during all this time where they were censored, they would put it in black and red. So that was a very quiet form of resistance.
So
but
black
if you
and
look
red,
at any Bohemia,
right? And black and red are the colors of the 26th of July movement, which was founded on the 26th of July, 1953, when Fidel Castro, attacked with, about 120 guys, the Moncada barracks that you had mentioned earlier. So if you go up to the beginning of the revolution, and we look at, how most people who view this interview who are not scholars of Cuba, they would probably assume that Cuba, given all they've heard since at least since 1961 from the Cuban government, they would assume that Cubans were mostly illiterate, and that, of course, that's a fiction. It was deeply a fiction in the cities of Cuba, especially Havana, which had a 92% literacy rate in 1959. But it was also very much part of the lore of the revolution to promote this for the last 65 years. And yet there are all these really important questions that, as a result of people's assumptions and the lore created by the communist regime, that never get asked. And one of them is just a very simple question, which is, who are the readers? I would ask that because I don't know who the readers are per se, but I know that when you look at just something like a catalog listing at the Biblioteca Nacional, the National Library in Havana, you find that there were sometimes, dozens of newspapers in the provinces, in small towns, etc. But given that perhaps some of those were highly politicized and were subject to the subsidies you're talking about, nonetheless, you still have a huge number of newspapers nationwide. And so who would you say are the readers of the press? And I know that you're not necessarily focusing yourself on radio, but what is linked to the other? And it seems like Cubans were a huge consumer of the media in general before 59. So tell us about who these people were, and who are the loyal readers of the press? Who are the people who are getting pissed off because the journalists are being quiet or simply are being silenced? Who are these people? Who are the readers in Cuba?